Hello and welcome to this virtual discussion on M&A's role in portfolio building. I'm Lisa Urquhart, the head of the Evaluate Vantage, the online news service from Evaluate. And joining me today is Evan Lippman, head of corporate development and evaluation from Takeda, Andy Pasternak, executive vice president and chief strategy officer for Horizon Therapeutics, Stephanie Luzon, partner and head of Torreya, and Nicholas Franco, Executive Vice President and Chief Business Development Officer for Actelion. So to kick off the discussion, we have a few slides looking at M&A trends and the general market at the moment, which should help frame the discussion. I'm going to start with M&A trends, and then I'm going to hand over to Stephanie, who's going to lead us through data on the current market conditions. So here's our first slide, and here we're looking at quarterly M&A trends since 2016. And what you see here we've done is we've separated out mega mergers to give us an idea of the real deal trends. And what we can see quite clearly here is the number of deals, which is plotted by the green line, has fallen off quite substantially over the last few quarters. And deal volumes are actually at a 4-year low at the moment. In terms of the first quarter of the year, it would have been quite miserable if it hadn't been for the fact of Gilead's 4.7 billion takeout of 47. That helped the numbers, as did Lilly's 1.1 billion takeout of Dermira. And then if we go to Q2, it's looking even more depressed. But I think one of the things what's actually helped was the fact that Horizon Therapeutics did their deal, which has flattered the Q2 numbers. But what we can see is the trend. There's a clear trend that M&A is actually falling off. So if we move on to look at pipelines, and this slide gives us an idea of what Big Pharma is doing in terms of its late stage pipeline. So we've got phase 3 NMEs, and we've got contrasting Big Pharma and Big Biotech. And so we all know that M&A is driven by the strategic need to strengthen pipelines. So this slide looks at where late stage innovation is coming from both Big Pharma on the left and Big Biotech on the right. And so what we can see on the slide from Big Pharma is that NME, new innovation products, are falling in all 3 directions in terms of in-license, acquisition, and organic. The situation is slightly more mixed when it comes to Big Biotech. As we can see, acquisitions are also falling, and in-license has taken a massive dive, whereas Big Biotech is one of the few places where organic growth appears to be growing. So I think what we can conclude from this slide is the fact there is a need, perhaps mainly from Big Pharma, to do M&A. But if that's not happening, where is the innovation coming from? So here we can look at licensing deal activity, which hasn't, as we can see, flattened off despite some of the interesting things that happen in the interest moment, particularly COVID-19. So while M&A has fallen off generally, and I think the first 2 quarters show that COVID is having an impact, it appears that licensing hasn't been quite as affected. And this basically looks at the whole industry. So it's not just Big Biotech and Big Pharma. So the deal trends are slightly different. And also we've extrapolated the data from May 25th out to the whole of 2020. So that's a kind of estimate of what could happen by the end of the year. But as we all know, the situation could change. But it shows that despite we've seen a decline in M&A, licensing seems to be holding up quite well over the last year and the last quarter as well. And that could be a function of the fact that people are perhaps more cautious around M&A. And then if we break it down further into the number of licensing deals per month, again, we can see that it is relatively stable. So it further emphasizing licensing deals are still being done across the industry and despite COVID-19. So maybe one of the questions we might want to pose later on in the panel is, if M&A is falling off, is licensing the new M&A? And on that note, I think I'm going to hand over to Stephanie to look at some of the market trends across the industry. Stephanie, you ready?
Thank you. So if you could go to the next slide, Lisa.
There we go.
There we go. Thank you. This is the NASDAQ Biotech Index. This is a market cap weighted index of about 210 biotech shares. And what this is, it goes back to 1993. So it shows over this period of time, the really significant value creation that's happened in the sector. But we all know that COVID, has had quite a significant impact in the market more recently. In February, between February and March, this biotech index fell 28%, which was a really huge change. And then since then, it's actually recovered and is actually at an all-time record. So we have to put this in the context of the overall market. At the same period of time that the biotech index was falling, the overall market was also dropping quite significantly, also about a third, asking, what is the new normal? And we had a huge amount of volatility. There's a volatility index that is, you can find on the Chicago Board of Options. And that's very important for biotech to understand the financing market, which we'll talk about in a moment. Typically, that volatility index ranges between 10 and 20. And during this period, in the February-March timeframe, the volatility index, or what we call the VIX, actually went above 65, which was huge. It was a number that we haven't seen since the 2008 financial crisis. And now we're back down to a level like 25. And that's very important because it indicates that the volatility has come back from almost unprecedented levels. And now we're in a market, this huge uptick that we've seen since the lower levels this year is indicative that we're really kind of in a momentum phase in the market, and healthcare has become defensive for investors. It's delivering growth at a time when many other sectors are not. Biotech is seen actually at the core of helping to address some of the COVID issues. And we also see investors within healthcare moving from other sectors like generics or commercial pharma into biotech, and even investors outside of healthcare moving into biotech to seek exposure to this COVID situation. So it's really an interesting opportunity. It's a really almost unprecedented time, as you can see from this chart. And maybe if we move to the next chart, Lisa, if you don't mind. This just looks at IPO activity back through 2011. And you'll see that at the current time, where this volatility index I mentioned is above 20 at about 25, 27, we're actually seeing very, very low levels of IPOs and financing, IPO financing for companies. Over the period, if you look back to sort of May to November 2019, you see that was quite a significant period of biotech activity, and this volatility index was well below 20 in the sort of range of 12 to 20. And so we're in this period now, and it'll be interesting to see how it evolves, but the IPO time market seems to be tricky at the moment. And if we move to the next slide, just also to put in context some of the strategic activity we'll be talking about, this looks at the follow-on activity for biotech companies. That means once a company is already public, when they issue additional shares. You've seen that the overall market has bounced back and volatility has declined and flattened. And we've had a number of good news events, whether it's M&A or a number of COVID opportunities that have created opportunities that have attracted investors' interest. And so you've seen quite a big uptick. In fact, in May this month so far, if you look back over the monthly trends, there's been a huge amount of money raised relative to historical levels. And I think that if you're a biotech CFO sitting back and looking at the market, where in the past, we weren't sure what was the new normal, the market was very volatile, and it looked like it might actually be shut with a very uncertain long-term view. You don't need to have too sharp a pencil to say, if this market's open, I should do what I can to try to raise money. And the next slide just highlights, again, that May 2020 was one of the largest single months for follow-ons in biotech. So that would be an interesting place to leave it when we want to talk about moving on to M&A and different strategic opportunities for biotech companies. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie, for that. I'm hoping that's given everybody a sort of a vague idea of what's going on in the industry. Obviously, one of the big things is COVID-19. So I think some of the historic trends we've seen might not be applicable to what we're going to see in the future. On that note, if we're going back to the idea of M&A in these times, do we think, I mean, one of the things you looked at, Stephanie, was the fact that money raised and everything like that. So we've got a separate thing with valuations, where we're in volatile markets where valuations are very uncertain. Has that kind of, do you think, made an impact on the way people are looking at how they do M&A? I think I'll start with Andy, because I think you're the most recent person that's dipped their toes in the M&A waters recently.
I think, thanks for the question, Lisa. I don't think that the recent volatility for companies in our situation has had a dramatic impact on how we think about M&A. And we're still focused on the long term and our strategic objectives, and thinking on that basis as opposed to reacting to near-term market volatility. At least that's how we've thought about it.
Okay, and I suppose my other interest is that's how is Big Pharma? I mean, we've got two big Pharma perspectives. As Nicholas, now you're part of Big Pharma. So I mean, is that something that you're seeing? Is the fact that this is no matter how dramatic it is and how much it's impacting our lives, is this a short-term thing when you're thinking strategically about M&A?
Our view of, and I agree with Andy, our view of M&A has not changed due to this situation. M&A plays a role in the overall portfolio strategy and long-term growth of the company. This volatility is, you can say there's volatility at the NBI level, but if you look at good value assets, this is what, everybody has their list of potential interested companies. The good ones have not suffered during this period of time. Maybe the ones that were on the border, of science or attractiveness have maybe suffered more than the others. But for J&J, our view of acquisitions has not changed.
And Evan, I mean, could you add anything there again from the kind of sort of slightly larger pharma perspective?
Certainly, Lisa. I would say, similarly to my colleagues on the panel, the appetite for merger and acquisition or any externalization activities is not significantly adjusted at Takeda as a result of the current health disruption. What has occurred, as we can all imagine, is the effect on the human element associated with companies and patients, for that, importantly, is that some of the timelines have elongated currently. And so I think, as you and Stephanie highlighted in your slides, some of the disconnect versus history may be attributable simply to the initial uncertainty, but also the fact that M&A is a labor-intensive activity that requires a lot of diligence, valuation, and collaborative effort across multiple organizations. And because of the current health situation, some of the timelines have shifted, but not our overall appetite associated with the activity.
And so, in terms of the human element around M&A, I think one of the biggest things is the fact that people can't meet in person anymore. It's difficult to travel. As you said, things are taking longer. So, I mean, that is going to have some sort of follow through into maybe quarter by quarter M&A trends. Stephanie, have you got a view on that?
I think the human element is very important in general, and for both partnering and for M&A. I think that we're in an industry, because of all of these conferences and all of this interaction at both medical and partnering conferences, there is, in many cases, there is a series of established relationships that can form kind of the foundation of ongoing activities, diligence, other kinds of activities. And so I think that's helpful. I think, at the same time, a certain amount of face-to-face interaction, and particularly in certain diligence items, it tends, we find that it tends to be more important for things like, when you need to do manufacturing site visits or other kinds of things like that. That's tricky. But in terms of reviewing, some, clinical data, other data, a lot of that can be done via Zoom calls and other data rooms and things like that. But I think given the history and the social aspects of this industry, I think it's a little bit easier, but it's not going to work forever.
Okay, and so I suppose I'm gonna go back to Andy. Andy, that's interesting. But one of the things I noticed on the charts that we looked at was the fact there were massive sort of like, in licensing, there's big spikes in, if you look at it quarter by quarter, in January, by month in January, which, as we all know, is JP Morgan. So, that is one of the biggest deal making and sort of, is it that people just announcing deals there, or is it the fact that they are actually happening months before? So does it matter that things like JP Morgan aren't, and, Bios and the ASCOs of this world aren't happening?
It's a good question. I think obviously Bio's happening now in this virtual context, and time will tell whether that will prove to be as effective. There's no doubt that forums like JP Morgan are a great opportunity to get close to other companies and learn more about what they're doing. And I think that does serve as a bit of a marker and a milestone for companies. And I think you see a lag in activity that comes out of events like that. So I do think those are important forums, but I think we're all adapting to this world, finding other ways to connect with partners, kind of off cycle, if you will. And I think that as it relates to those early conversations or early phases of due diligence, all that is quite doable in this type of environment. I think, as Stephanie mentioned, when you're talking about larger transactions that involve acquiring commercial assets and manufacturing facilities, that gets trickier. And then in general, the later you are in due diligence, the more creative you have to get about how you do that earlier is a bit easier through virtual means.
I suppose, Evan, I'm going to ask you around the manufacturing issue, because obviously you can't go and do those inspections anymore, and it is a crucial part of any form of M&A. So how are companies getting around that bit of due diligence?
Well, so I'd say it's a twofold. One is that has been highlighted. There are a number of opportunities to at least look at the documentation relevant to regulatory items through the data rooms and have very specific, transparent conversations with the counterparty, because they know it's important. And for us, it's the opportunity to bring our expertise to bear, having gone through multiple product commercialization and launches, whereas let's just say it's a smaller company, you can have those initial conversations electronically and be able to kind of hypothesize and co-create an answer. I would mention, though, that in a number of locations now, the sites are opening up. And so we have been able to begin in a very limited and controlled manner to send individuals, particularly who are already in the host country, so we're not causing any geographic issues, to attend. And that is beginning to help the dialogue accelerate, particularly in very complex manufacturing processes such as gene therapy, cell therapy, biologics. It's really critical to try and get on the ground. And we're seeing certain geographies open up, which may portend an acceleration of activity in the second half of this year.
Okay. So I can go back to, the question of, so that's how we can do deals remotely. But in terms of how you value those deals, has that changed? Because I know that one of the discussions we've had previously was the fact that because we've had a little bit of a roller coaster in terms of share prices, which seems to be settling down now, are people doing sort of buying companies at risk of being opportunistic, given that some of the deal valuations have fallen and perhaps some companies that maybe not have as good access to capital structures might be in more distress than others? I think that's something you've picked up on before, Stephanie. So would you like to answer that question? Are there sharks swimming in the waters now?
I think I was just actually looking for a note I had made. That NASDAQ Biotech chart that I showed earlier, there are some companies, because it's market cap weighted, while it's still at an all-time record, probably half of the companies are not at an all-time record, and can be down significantly. So it's not, there's sort of still winners and losers in this arena. And I think the conversations I've had with potential acquirers suggest that people are trying to find the right way to look at valuation, and not necessarily assume that just because a company might be at a relative low valuation, that that's the only thing that they should look at. I think we're in an evolving world, and people don't want to seem to be predatory, but they definitely want to find a way to create good value for both sides on, the right kind of value in a transaction. And that may mean needing to look at other metrics than we might have only been using in more stable environment.
I'm going to throw this back to Nicholas. What other metrics might you want to look at in terms of, what you might be looking at differently given the current situation? What sort of valuation metrics?
In addition to the standard, valuation of the main assets of the company, agreeing on, rather than using, the last 20-day trading or 60-day trading, to look at a more longer term view of how the company has traded over time. I think that gets over that, we're currently depressed and you're being a predator and you're taking advantage of me. But to give the right value to the asset. I haven't seen, and I haven't heard, about my other colleagues of, companies trying to be predatory at this point in time. Maybe they're not being published. Those transactions are not being published. But I don't think my other colleagues in other big pharma don't seem to be doing that either.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you, is it more of a wait and see approach at the moment then, rather than, I know lots of deals are being done, but not at the same sort of level as we've seen before. And I was wondering what might be driving that.
Yeah, timing has been a big discussion at J&J right now. So, will COVID pass? Will markets rebound? Will companies, reevaluate? But a good asset, it's not the market often doesn't drive transactions. It's actually the assets in the company, the timing of those assets, and the need and the fit of the buyer. So I think we live with. I'm sure my colleagues, with Andy and Evan would agree that we live with what happens in the market or the market vagaries. But the timing is based on, a great company has published fantastic phase 2 results and you were waiting for those, and that's the trigger. It's not whether the stock is high or low. That makes things more difficult sometimes, but it's other triggers and the fit within the company and what the company needs.
Okay, well, that's an interesting point you said about perhaps it's data that's triggering. One of the things we definitely have seen due to COVID is those is clinical trials being suspended or basically on hold. So that is surely going to have an implication on how companies can conduct M&A, because we aren't getting those catalysts. I don't know, Evan, would you like to speak to that?
I'm sorry, did you say Evan?
Evan, yeah, sorry.
Okay, yeah. So as Nicholas mentioned, I think innovation in our industry is always the hurdle that we're looking for, right? That is what's for the patient benefit. And because you want to see the data, our expectation when we look at both CRO organizations and published information across the industry, we have seen a slowdown across multiple therapeutic areas in the timelines associated with the outcome of the trials. The enrollment is slipping, as you know. The health system burden has caused difficulty for patients to go and get drug for trial. And even though the best efforts of all companies trying to ensure that the patients are getting the necessary medicine and to get the outcome, it's just very difficult. So I would say our expectation is timing will elongate. I do, though, believe it's an opportunity. If a company has a financing need and they have an inability to get it from the marketplace, although the market does remain quite dynamic, whether you're private or you're public, I do think having, again, a very open conversation with the companies that are close to you in the pharma and biotech world, that can enable a structure to be set that could help the company still realize value and ensure that the trials are continued and finished within an elongated period if capital is a concern. So I think this can also provide an opportunity currently to think about multiple structures that could work for different companies in order to assess the opportunity while we're waiting for the data. That's something I think we might see more of.
I'm going to put this over to Andy. How would that work in reality, Andy? I mean, you know, there you are. I've been waiting for my phase 2 results. I know that, you know, it's a go or no go on a licensing deal or M&A, but I've now had to suspend my trials for I don't know how long. I mean, what would a restructuring of that arrangement look like in terms of getting that M&A done?
So I just want to make sure I understand your question, Lisa. You're saying from the perspective of the buyer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, it comes down to, it's very opportunity and situation specific, depending on what data you're waiting for and whether, in fact, that's going to be disrupted or not, which really varies across the board. I think we have a general view that things are disrupted, but it varies a lot. What's the modality? Where are they in the phases of their trial? Are they early in enrollment, or are they already fully enrolled? So it's very situation specific, whether it's going to disrupt their timeline and how much and what type of data they can make available. I think there are creative approaches to trying to make some data available, some interim data available, which gives you some type of a view if that doesn't compromise the trial, of course. So I think we're working through all those kinds of situations, but it does become pretty opportunity specific.
I'm going to throw that. So I'm going to ask Stephanie a follow-up question from that. So if we are looking at perhaps truncated data sets for people to be making decisions on, do you think that is going to alter how deals again are structured? So if people have to submit incomplete data to perhaps interested parties, would that alter deal structures or how M&A is done?
Well, I think, excuse me, I think we've already had the emergence of a number of sort of structured transactions. And, you know, that has become, I mean, clearly it's obviously very common on the partnering side. On the M&A side, it's become also more prevalent. If a company doesn't have a completed data set available, then there may be a way to change that with structure or to address that with structure in an M&A context. It really comes down also to whether the pharma company involved or the acquirer involved is willing to take a risk without that data, because it is a greater risk, and it's not always the case that, in our experience, that acquirers are willing to move without more certainty. They'd often rather pay more for more certainty than take a risk, a data-driven risk, if there's a specific data point that they're waiting for.
Okay.
Yeah, you're right, Stephanie, especially if it's the core asset that's driving the transaction.
Okay, so it's just
And
seems
again,
like, sorry, carry on.
Sorry, I was just going to add that it is hard to talk about this generally, because I think it depends on where do those data sit in the broader context of the package that you're looking at. What data you've already seen, what preclinical data do you have, et cetera. So it does depend a little bit on the nature of the total package.
Okay.
And maybe, Lisa, to answer your question maybe more directly, if the other assets are still down in an acquisition of a company, this is where, you know, CVRs can come in as a potential way to bridge the gap between the initial acquisition and a data point that's going to come in the near future.
Okay, so we might see less about outright acquisitions, more about kind of sort of like, you know, payments, and then more contingency value rights. So is that how you think it might be more structured, less upfront and more earnouts as we go forward?
Well, in an acquisition, you either buy or you don't buy, but especially of a public company, so you would buy the company and structure a CVR along with it that would pay out at a certain, you know, point. But yes, but to your other, what you think you're alluding to is, will there be more licensing deals versus M&A? I'm not sure we can say that, or the situation is actually different. I don't know what Andy and Evan would think, but I think the situation isn't really different. You know, most of the times, if we can get the asset we want without having to buy the company, maybe that's a better route, to either through an asset acquisition or through a licensing deal. The usual times of M&As are when either it's huge and there's a lot of assets, or you can't get to the asset that you want through a licensing deal.
Okay.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that it also depends on what your thesis is with the deal. If it's truly just about getting access to a product candidate versus you may have broader capabilities you're trying to access, you may be trying to buy a platform, a geographic capability, whatever that is, obviously that will steer you towards M&A. So that's obviously a key distinction between the two.
And I might just add, you know, another sort of middle ground, which we haven't seen used that often in public companies, is, you know, there may be some form of option structure that emerges, which is kind of a middle ground between buying the whole company plus a CVR versus making an equity investment, which Evan mentioned as a potential interim sort of mechanism. You know, if a company needs financing, that might be another way to go about things.
Yeah, I was going to say,
I do
it's
think we'll
important
see the emergence of more and more structure. Excuse me. Go ahead, Evan. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think it's important to differentiate as we're doing between private companies and public companies. You know, Takeda did a transaction which, you know, was the build to buy approach, which I wouldn't say is a common preferred structure. We did with PVV Biologics, where we just acquired them in February. They met the phase 1 outcome on the celiac disease. We had worked with them over that period of time. It triggered that, and we, you know, now own that opportunity, and we'll move it forward into 2B. As you say, Stephanie, it's a little harder when these things are public entities, whether you have to structure a CVR or you do an asset deal, as Nicholas mentioned. But they're all options to consider, particularly in the current environment, where you might even do a staged approach, where you do a minority equity stake, get access to the asset, advance it, move it forward, and then potentially look at the opportunity in the future if you think it's appropriate.
So in terms of the other things we talked about in terms of structure, so I mean, if licensing if we're going to have more structured deals, does that change what people are actually looking at, or is it still the fact that, you know, you are looking at good assets and there are particular therapy areas that are still more attractive than others? I mean, do we think COVID is going to make a difference, or the M&A trends in terms of maybe what you're actually looking at in terms of phases or stages? Is it easier to, I don't know, is it easier in this current climate to do maybe early stage deals than it is perhaps late stage deals?
I don't know what Andy and Evan think, but I don't see that, Lisa. I think it all goes back to the company strategy and balancing the portfolio and where, you know, where our interests lie. Clearly, there are areas that are still hotter than others. Oncology remains very hot, as opposed to anti-infectives, although maybe COVID is changing that. I'm not sure that that's probably a blip, but, you know, that hasn't changed very much in my assessment.
Okay. I mean, that's the other thing we did talk about on the previous call, was the fact that we don't think there's going to be a rush into vaccines or I don't know, antivirals, because, you know, it is a blip. But there does seem to be an awful lot of market attention around these companies. Should investors be wary, the people perhaps maybe looking to make sort of money on takeouts, the fact that the industry is a long-term play rather than a short-term investment opportunity? I mean, Evan, I think you've got an opinion on this one.
Well, I would say that Takeda does have a vaccines group, you know, yeah, the dengue product that's nearer term, but it is, as you mentioned, vaccines is a longer term approach to human health, and it's usually broad-based and it's global in nature generally. And so it's a significant manufacturing investment, and it's a health system approach where you work with government and payer agencies in order to ensure that people have access to the medication. So I think your fundamental question is, if you're an investor or you're a player in vaccines, does COVID change your approach? I think we all want to help solve the COVID problem, so there may be greater collaboration across companies to pool resources, which we are seeing, in order to meet that objective. But I would not expect new players to come in or for people to change their strategy as a result. But it may spur some new investment. And I think we're seeing that new investment as a result.
Yeah. I agree with Evan. As you have read, J&J has announced its candidate for the vaccine, but that's because we were in vaccines. We had the Ebola vaccine, and our platform is expandable to other targets. So we didn't jump in just because of COVID-19, but we thought we could maximize the platform that we have and bring the vaccine to market as rapidly as possible. And you've also seen we've announced several collaborations to Evan's point. I think this is maybe unprecedented time of collaboration across not only pharma companies, but pharma companies, manufacturing companies, to make sure that there's at-risk manufacturing even before, or the setup, even before the final results are available. That's happening, and we all want to solve this issue.
Okay. But I mean, you talk about the collaborations, which is interesting. You're right, we haven't seen this level of collaboration before in the industry. Do you think that might mean that rather than doing M&A, people might be more interested in doing collaborations, particularly between, well, the big thing we've seen is big pharma groups? I mean, could we see more sort of asset sharing and co-development rather than, perhaps asset sales that we've seen, or perhaps smaller companies? We've seen obviously the collaboration between smaller biotechs and big pharma companies around vaccines and antivirals. Do you think that is a way forward as opposed to M&A? And I'm going to address that to Stephanie.
Oh, I think there are some examples where, if you go back in certainly several years, where there have been sort of joint efforts or joint collaborations between large pharma companies that have gone on for an extended period of time. I think generally over time, companies would like to control their assets and their strategy. And these joint ventures or joint collaborations, if they're put in place, something that's put in place, for example, right now for COVID to meet a specific urgent need, that's really optimizing the best that everyone has to offer to create a potential solution that could help everybody. That's fantastic. In terms of longer term strategic efforts, I think over time we've seen that those can be unstable and not necessarily for the long term. They can, on the other hand, they can be a stepping stone approach to gaining a broader access to certain assets or gaining expertise in an area. But my experience, I'd be interested in what the other panelists have to say. My experience is that generally companies would prefer to sort of own something that's core to their strategy.
I suppose we have seen a lot of some of the unraveling of some of the larger deals recently. I don't know, Nicholas, would you like to answer that one?
I agree with Stephanie. I think these are unique times. If you look at Sanofi and GSK, I think their collaboration is one needed one component of the vaccine, the other one had the other component. Okay, might as well collaborate. But I think in areas or in markets, therapeutic areas where there is more competition, I think that's not going to change the situation. There will be collaborations, that's clear. But that's under a licensing type of agreement or other form of collaboration, research alliances. But this one is different because most companies, and the panel will agree, are probably not into the COVID vaccine to make a huge return. That will probably not be the case. As we've announced that we will supply the vaccine, 1 billion doses of vaccine at cost sometime next year, hopefully early next year. But that doesn't.
Like Nicholas froze up.
Nicholas frozen.
Oh, there is.
He's back.
There is.
Oh, there you're back. Sorry.
You just froze for a second.
Oh, okay. Sorry about
I think we got the message though.
that. Okay.
Yeah, we heard about 1 billion free doses. We heard that.
No, not free. I said at cost. I said at cost.
I know.
You too.
I know.
Africa.
Giving you a hard time.
And the developing countries. Evan, would you like to, I mean, obviously, I mean, COVID is a very special thing, but you also, perhaps, do you agree that the fact it is around a specific problem and we are unlikely to see big scale collaborations perhaps except outside of license agreements? Or do you think, hey, maybe people use the idea of sharing risk around big projects? I don't know, what do you think?
Right, so I think COVID specific, we did the same thing, put together a plasma-derived therapeutics consortium where we're trying to ensure we get the plasma collection, get the antibody, IVIG going in order to be able to get it into patients at scale. And so we're working with a number of players globally, and I think that was a fantastic opportunity for pharmaceutical and biotech companies to come together in order to solve a particular problem at speed and scale to have impact on a global human health basis. Collaborations, by and large, have a similar intent. So the fundamental part of your question in my mind is, will we see more collaborations in the near term? Does this open up the receptivity? And I actually fundamentally believe yes. I think if you look at examples such as the Gilead Galapagos deal, you look at AstraZeneca, Daiichi Sankyo, you look at the GSK Pfizer joint venture that was formed on the consumer health basis. I do believe that when you're talking about significant investments, there can be an opportunity for companies to come together, collaborate, create unique structures in order to ensure that you get the best outcome associated with the risk-return profile. It doesn't mean that it will supplement M&A and licensing. I think that those two will continue into the future for all the reasons this panel has mentioned, but I also believe that given the disruption currently, it will open up the mindset of a number of people to think about alternative structures.
Andy, do you agree with that? Because I mean, one of the things I was looking at is the fact that it is unusual and maybe it will continue going forward. Is that something you believe, or are you more sort of like Nicholas is thinking the fact that it's specific problems, specific solutions?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a view on a broad trend, but what I'll say from our perspective is that I'd say that this is a very company philosophy specific question. From our perspective, we're open to collaborations, we're exploring things like that. To us, it comes down to what's the best way to get a therapy into the hands of patients and through the regulatory pathway. And if there's a way to do that in a better way, that's a collaboration of some sort, or a division of labor, or a partner takes it one step and then we take it another. It all depends on, does that go round? Is that a compelling way to get it? What are the capabilities of the partner versus us? And is there a way to do something that's better than just a more strict one party has control? So I think it comes down to each situation. If there's a way to do it where a collaboration makes sense to get that therapy to market to patients, then we're certainly open to that.
Okay. It's interesting you mentioned the idea of, I suppose, like getting drugs to patients. I mean, one of the things we looked at in terms of M&A when we had this previous discussion with the group was the fact that, are people more mindful now, given that there are going to be changes to the wider ecosystem, like job losses, more people losing their health insurance? Is that changing the assets you're looking at? Is it going to be the ones that are basically you are guaranteed a path of reimbursement or pricing? I don't know. Is that something you'd like to answer, Evan?
So I think it's fundamental, as Andy mentioned. Every company has its own philosophy and their approach, but we're all based in our own culture and our strategic direction. So at Takeda, we're focused in GI, CNS, oncology, and rare disease, and we have a plasma-derived therapy and vaccines business. So within oncology, rare disease, in all those areas, the hurdle of innovation is what drives the ultimate commercialization opportunity and acceptance by the regulatory bodies. So we believe fundamentally that payers and governments will continue to ensure access to medicine for innovation. And when we look at M&A and when we look at licensing opportunities, we are highly focused on innovative products, whether they're R&D or commercial assets, and that's what drives. It's not to say that model is specific to all organizations, because other types of modalities, whether it's a switch product or formulation enhancement, they do all have benefit to patients. It's just not Takeda's innovation-driven model and what we're looking for. I'll just say lastly, it therefore has not slowed our intent to partner or to acquire. We're looking at more than we have before, given really the burgeoning technological advances in our industry, and the fact that we are being able to treat diseases today that we could not, even 5 years ago. And so as a result of that, that's why we continue really to source and look at opportunities in order to really bolster our pipeline and our commercial efforts. But that's the Takeda view.
Okay. Nicholas, you have a different view? Because I mean, one of the things I'm looking at is the fact that there must be a short-term impact around people looking around pricing and reimbursement and market access if governments have less money to spend on their healthcare systems, and also individuals, perhaps. Yeah,
indeed, that is the case, Lisa. But innovation is the foundation. I agree completely with Evan. We have an entire organization within J&J that's called Global External Innovation, and that has several components under it, all the way from equity investment to M&A and across the sectors, either early or late investments, incubator through our J-Labs type incubator type approach through the J-Labs organization. But you are right that the governments are looking at saving money through pharma savings, through drugs, to cover some of the costs that have taken place over the unexpected costs that have taken place over the last several months. But again, for value, whatever we need to, they will be looking at value-driven approaches. It is possible that for certain categories, I think we've seen recently Novo's commitment to reducing the price of insulin, or the insulin price in the US being, for let me call that a commodity type product, or product that's been on the market for a very long time. That's where I think savings can indeed be made, and not, so that they can eventually fund the innovation, the innovation of the innovative products that Evan was mentioning.
Stephanie, I mean, do you think that there is, there will be a change around what people are looking at, or do you think it is what, as people have always said in this industry, it is about innovation and people will pay for innovation? Do you think that still stands true, or will do in the future?
Do you mean in an M&A context, or in a? Well,
when you're thinking about M&A, pricing and M&A, the two go hand in hand. You've got to think about, if you're buying something, eventually you're going to have to sell that product. So is that, is it, you should still be looking at innovation in the hope that there will be the spend for that? Or do you think because things have changed that maybe you might need to reconsider what you're looking at?
I think innovation and really meeting unmet medical needs, and significant unmet medical needs is something that society will always value. How that gets translated is, remains to be seen, and there may be new and different models that people approach. But clearly driving innovation, at least in the short term, well, I say short term, in the time horizon for which companies are planning now, seems to still be a core driver.
And in terms of those,
Lisa,
sorry,
I will, I think, bring a topic that may help with the conversation, maybe where you're trying to go, which is what I do think there may be is potentially a slight disconnect in the public market valuation set currently, and now that the NASDAQ is at the NASDAQ Biotech is at an all-time high, and potentially the future commercial opportunity associated with some of these products. And so I think that is something we will all be looking at when we do our valuation work, to ensure that at these levels that the transaction would make sense. So I just say it in a slightly different way than before, which is we always will look and consider for innovation, but we need to ensure that the transaction itself makes sense structurally and from a valuation standpoint.
But how do you ensure that? Because if you're all looking for innovation and we believe the market will pay, does that not mean that valuations, you're going to be in a competitive bidding process around those? So how do you manage the expectations around innovation and valuation if it is, you know, if that's what everybody's looking for. I don't know if anybody, I'm throwing that to everybody. Who wants to be the first one to pick that one up?
Sure. I mean, I'll just take a quick stab. I think that certainly is nothing new. We're in a competitive environment. There's always multiple parties that are interested in the same types of innovation. I think that, you know, each of us, and we certainly think about this as Horizon, we think about what do we bring to this opportunity where we think we can differentially add value, whether that's, if we're talking about something that's development stage, that's continuing the ongoing development, defining the regulatory pathway, building the, shaping the market, building the commercial pathway for that. That's how we would think about it. And hopefully the party that is the winner, if you will, is best able to demonstrate their ability to add value.
And Lisa, to Stephanie's point, meeting an unmet medical need is always going to be part of that equation. So valuing that is fundamental. But to Evan's point as well, you know, do you simply build in I don't know, in your model, a price increase because you can of X% a year? Maybe that's no longer the case, and you have to be much more thoughtful on what, you know, looking at your pricing strategy, your reimbursement strategy, the whole market access piece is more and more important. But that, I would say that has not been triggered by COVID-19. That has always been increasing over the last several years. But it maybe has been made more acute now, more in the forefront. But it's always been there.
And in terms of, I suppose the other element around it, one thing we haven't looked at is the private companies, because I mean, they're obviously a big strand of M&A and what's going on there. And I think what we're still seeing is like, we're seeing valuations for public companies are going up, but we're also seeing quite a lot of venture capital money still very well-funded private companies. So, I mean, how do you see M&A trends happening there? Because there might be a bit of a, I don't know, disconnect between what's happening in terms of capital deployed in VCs and then the wider markets in terms of IPO and M&A. I mean, do you think the situation might change given what's happening in the markets at the moment? Or I'm going to ask that one to Stephanie.
Okay. I think there's a few things to consider. I mean, at the moment, the IPO market is tricky. And so if a company is at a point in time where they need to make a strategic decision, either about, you know, how best to continue the development of a drug or even potentially launch a drug, you know, then you know, M&A, you know, is potentially even more interesting. We have seen a huge amount of money flow into the venture world in terms of financings. I don't have I was just looking for the numbers. I don't have the exact numbers to hand, but it's really kind of an unprecedented level of funding that's been put into the funds, which leaves them quite well placed to continue to fund their own companies. And we are seeing more and more, you know, that companies will choose to go an M&A route. And as Evan mentioned, it's very easy when a company is private to structure some additional consideration, you know, that can come over time as certain milestones are met. And that can be, you know, very, very lucrative. You know, investors are less exposed to the volatility of the market and potentially less exposed to additional dilution. You know, so there's a number of advantages to considering M&A, you know, as a private company, and particularly depending on where you're based. If for European companies, you know, the market, the IPO market can be quite challenging. That they often need to look to the U.S. And so I think we'll continue to see M&A from private companies, acquisitions of private companies, driving that value for those investors.
Okay. So by the sound of things, I mean, anybody else have anything to add on that one, or?
I would say the only piece it was shown in your one of your slides is the IPO volume has dropped significantly, and I think as we know that with private companies, the exit is either an M&A takeout or an IPO, which can be different motivations by whether you are the limited partner or you could be management because of preference rights associated with that. So I do think that if capital markets and IPOs remain shut for an elongated period of time, we will see more private company M&A transpire. Just if it goes out, we're talking a year plus. It's just something I think as private companies look at their runway, they'll have to consider, and we continue to have dialogues, whether it's with the venture capitalists or the principals themselves.
So it's by the sounds of things, it's saying we're thinking there might be more M&A from private companies who need the exit, but maybe not so much from the public companies, given what's happening in the NASDAQ and valuations at the moment. Is that a very rough approximation?
It's obviously a different, as a private company, you're making a different trade-off. There is ample access right now to venture funding, particularly for good ideas. So I think it's less of a capital constraint. I think it's more of a decision around what is the best path forward for your program. Are you better positioned continuing as a standalone company, pushing that forward with private financing versus aligning with a strategic? And what are you solving for? Are you trying to just get to a next milestone because venture funding is staged and gets you from point A to point B? And sometimes that makes a ton of sense, and sometimes that compromises your ability to think about the long term of what's the best way to get something to market and get it to patients. So I think it's a bit of a different calculus if you're a private company and you're thinking through that.
Okay. I'm very conscious of the fact we're coming to the very end of the conversation. I'm not sure if we've drawn too many ready conclusions. Perhaps maybe that I say private companies might be more willing to accept M&A these days. But in terms of, I'd like by ending by asking you what you think your long-term and short-term trends are going to happen in M&A. So what are your predictions for the future, long-term and short-term, in terms of M&A? I'm going to start with you, Andy.
Okay.
We're all happy to start with you.
Yeah, no, Stephanie, I think you're probably best positioned amongst all of us to answer that question. But I'd say in the short term, I think you'll continue to see activity for sure on the partnering and licensing front. I think we're all looking at that. I think pharma, whether it's a large pharma or SMID cap, have ample capital and ample desire to continue to grow and add innovation to their pipelines. In the long term, I think it's hard to speculate what will happen to M&A 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I think ultimately those get to larger macro questions about how our industry is valued and reimbursed. And those things obviously have a pretty significant impact on how much innovation investment there is. And that in turn drives deal activity. So I think in the longer term, some of those macro factors will play themselves out.
Okay. I'm going from left to right, so there's no on my screen. So that means Evan's up next.
I do think short term we'll see a preponderance of licensing and structured transactions, and I think that there's a good rationale for that. We're taking a pause from what I'll say are the large scale M&A. I just think it would be very challenging to execute that. Of course, when I say that, let's see what happens. But I do really believe that in the mid to longer term, we will see continued consolidation at both ends of the market, meaning the smaller players trying to get scale and get larger, and the larger players continuing to bulk up scale. And that'll create more opportunity to ensure the R&D investment continues into the future. So that's how I see the market kind of playing out.
Okay, when do you think we're going to see a return to the large scale M&A? Any predictions on that one? Because you said it's very challenging. I mean, integrating large companies is challenging anyway, but in these times, even more challenging.
I just remember. Sorry, go ahead, Evan.
No, go ahead, Evan.
I was just going to say, I just remember when a couple of the really large transactions I've worked on over the years, in both cases, the CEOs both said to us, it is such a lot, that kind of transaction gets driven very much usually by company specific issues, because if you have a massive patent cliff issue, I mean we've just seen the Allergan deal, for example, very specific reasons to drive that kind of transaction, because you know, unless there's either a significant, you know, core innovation or other opportunity that's missing in a big company, those massive transactions are, you know, cause a huge amount of disruption, time commitment, and you know, things almost go on hold while everything gets integrated, sorted. I find them, you know, generally there's a reason, there's some specific reason that forces somebody to do that, because generally not what people are like in their day-to-day life. That's just me on the outside. You guys are living it, so I'm more interested in your views.
So who do you think, Stephanie?
I do feel the need to clarify that, having done the Shire Takeda transaction. So I would say that there is no need that would predicate such a transaction. It generally works for the two organizations that are involved, and they see the opportunity into the future. I'm speaking from my company's perspective. I can say that there may be other companies that have different pressures associated with that, but would say that I think the driving factor into the near term really is the fiduciary responsibility of the board and executive management. And because these large scale transactions, as you highlight, are so complex, that in the current disruptive sense, I think that's one angle that just needs to be assured. And we would need to see that the market is at least normalized before you could deploy. We're talking tens of billions of dollars of capital. And I think people would want to be assured that their investment, you know, meets all the hurdles. But I just wanted to reply to Stephanie's comment about impetus. We felt very strongly that this was a fantastic opportunity for us in order to get global reach, scale, and bring more medicines to patients. And that was the impetus of the transaction.
Well, and maybe to broker a settlement between Evan and Stephanie, I'd say as I reflect on transactions over time, I think in truth there are a mix of the two. There are some where companies felt that they had no choice but to do something, and there's others where companies certainly had a choice, but they felt it was a great opportunity for them to capitalize on something. And I think we've seen examples of both of those over time.
So Stephanie, I'm going to return to you in terms of your predictions for M&A trends, and if you want to sort of, like, you know, divulge which companies you think might want to do M&A for various reasons, feel free to tell us.
I mean, I think, you know, that, you know, putting aside large scale transactions, and I agree with Evan, I think, I suspect those are off the table for a little while. You know, I think wherever there's innovation and the opportunity for, you know, exciting products or platforms or technologies to be brought in-house and expanded, or, you know, added, you know, value added to them, as people were saying, what can we do to add value here? I think that will always continue. And I think partnerships is also just the daily bread and butter of this industry. That certainly will continue. And when something flips into M&A, that's always it's always tough to predict when that will happen.
Okay. Would you like to nail your colours to the mast and say what, everybody talks about innovation, but any particular areas of innovation you think might be the sort of hot topics that people will be looking at over the next 12 months?
Well, I would hand that to the colleagues from the industry, but I mean,
okay,
trends in M&A, you know, certainly oncology is always an exciting area, always a hot area, and there's so much activity and such, you know, a constant stream of innovation that's an area where, if you just look therapeutic category wise, there's always a very significant amount of opportunity. We're also seeing, you know, big activity in gene therapy, for example. That there are certain technologies that you've seen over the years that come to the market, and they're going to be the great, you know, the great amazing thing, and then they take a little while to reach their real potential. And we saw that with monoclonal antibodies. We saw that, you know, with some of the genomics things. I think we're in that moment now with gene therapy, where people are realizing that actually there's a huge amount of value that can be derived here. And, you know, it takes a while. When not any one of those new technologies comes in, I think often it takes a while for those to reach their real potential, but that does happen over time.
Yeah. mRNA seems to be increasing over the last year or 2 years as a viable methodology or the viable treatment alternative. So I think that's an area that we'll see more of in the future. But to answer your major point, Lisa, I think you'll still see the mega deals. Hopefully, there's usually 1 or 2 a year. It may be delayed not because of the deal itself, of not being able to do the deal, because there's always ways of doing that. But companies will have to realize that integration or the transition and integration of the companies is going to take a longer period of time, and that's where you need to then you need to build that into your timetable, and that's you don't want to artificially prolong that period of pain as that's usually the case in many companies. So we may see a little bit of a delay there when as the markets or geography starts to open up.
And does everybody think that's going to happen by the 4th quarter? I mean, that seems to be, that was one of the consensus. I mean, when are things going to open up? This is my final question before we all have to say goodbye. When's the world going to open up, everybody?
I don't know that we're really well positioned to forecast how COVID is going to transpire, and whether we're going to have a second wave or whether there's going to be a vaccine, will it be effective, and when. And I think we're all just operating in a world of a lot of uncertainty right now.
On that note, I think I would like to thank you all, and sorry for disappearing for a little bit halfway through it. I just realised that my laptop was about to run out of power. I quickly go to the power cord, otherwise they would have all ended. So yes, sorry if I just disappeared without saying anything. So thank you all very much for what's been a very interesting conversation. So thank you, Andy, thank you, Evan, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.